Joining us from. My name is Adam Cheatham. I'll be your host today for the Confluential's live stream. I'm the CEO of Confluential, and today we're here to talk about what we call the Devil's Triangle. So we'll talk a little bit about defining it and a couple of different things, but first, like to give a little bit of background and welcome our guest, Dan Krug. So what we're talking about today is the space by which issues arise from misalignments between leadership, operations, and the IT department, technical departments. And so we'll dig into this for a bit throughout the call. Would love to hear your comments and where you guys are joining us from today. But super excited to share this topic with you guys because we find that it is one of the most critical issues that we solve at Confluential with folks that are unable to really achieve what it is they were seeking to achieve. So take a moment, give Dan Krug a moment to introduce himself as well.
Good morning, Dan Krug, the principal of Pyramus Consulting Group and also a partner with the Confluential. I spent almost 30 years in industry, 20 of it in the steel industry, some of that time in operations, some of it in HR, and some of it leading IT. So I've got perspective as a technology user, a person interested in integrating technology and operations for improvement, and someone who's led technology. So I've experienced, and also at the strategic level, creating a technology strategy for a Fortune 100 company. So from all of the different angles we'll be talking about today, I've experienced perspective, and it's really our discussion is about how we pull those perspectives together.
Absolutely, well, and thanks for joining us. Of course, and as we talk about this, want to just set the stage by defining what the Devil's Triangle is, because we've had a lot of conversations behind the scenes about this, and really, I've had a lot of great discussion about all the consequences of it. But from your perspective, what is the Devil's Triangle?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I think it's something that everybody probably kind of knows what it is, but we've defined it. So in any organization, big or small nowadays, technology is a part of enabling your business. So you've got strategic leadership, the executive team that's charting out the strategy of the organization, and they're normally challenging the organization to integrate technology to accelerate the strategic drivers that get them to where they're going to be. So the executive team is creating a strategic charter, if you would, of how technology fits into the organization. You've got the operational leaders and team that actually have to get the work done in the organization to drive the value of the business. And ultimately, they're the people who have to consume the technology to make their processes better. So they actually have to enable the work to get done. And then the third angle of the triangle is the technology group, the IT or digital team that actually has to procure, identify, bring the technology to the table and integrate it into the business so that it can accelerate those initiatives. And not surprisingly, each of those three different stakeholder groups may have different perceptions about what the technology is, how it can be implemented, whose responsibility it is, and how the people and the business processes and the technology come together to actually create value for your customers.
Yeah.
And the further apart those 3 points of the triangle are, the bigger the mess you get, the closer they are together, the more streamlined execution, and the quicker you realize the value.
Fair enough. And what I think the simplest, easiest, biggest question in all of this is comes from an executive mindset, which is, well, if I set the strategy, people just go and do it, right? That's all I got to do is set the strategy, and it's supposed to just happen, right? So why doesn't that work?
Yeah. So my experience, both inside of large organizations as a leader in the company, as a member of an executive team, and then over the last several years consulting with large organizations, the executives of large organizations or even smaller organizations are typically not technologists. They have an idea of outcomes. They have heard stories, anecdotes, case studies. They've gotten guidance. They're getting pressure from boards to integrate technology. AI is a great example we should have an AI strategy. What's our AI strategy? They have ideas of where AI may help their business. They don't necessarily understand how AI fits in to the rhythm, to the processes, to the mechanics of the organization to actually improve the business. So they're chartering a strategic direction. They're asking for an acceleration based on what's happening in the broader environment without really understanding the specifics of what drives it. A lot of times executives will have come up through the business. They'll understand the core operations. If it's a bank, they understand finance. If it's a metals company, they understand how you get hot metal. They understand the core of the business. Well, nowadays, technology has become a core part of every business. And most executive teams don't understand that as much as they would the core function of the business.
Well, that makes a ton of sense because it's you kind of grow into that space, and by this, the necessity of the role, right? I've worked with some very talented executives that do know down to the level of detail, like if this step in the routing moves to this step, and if this changes wrong, then we have a total impact on our throughput. That's a very rare executive that understands it to that level and can execute a strategy effectively, right? Those are two skill sets. That doesn't mean that an executive doesn't know that level of detail, but in the executive role, being able to provide a strategic leadership platform, those two capabilities don't often coincide in the same individual, right? So what happens is you create space within the organizational structure, and at least in my mind, where the leadership has to pull up and has to see this macro level, and then at the operational and the technical component, there's a micro level of execution, and the space between those, from the top to those two legs on the bottom, it starts to create a challenge the farther apart they are, right? That doesn't mean that from a hierarchy perspective, we had to be a flat organization. It just means that message needs to be nice and tight and neat, right? You and I have been in a number of workshops where we ask even the executive team, right? You got the COO, CFO, CEO, CIO, all sitting at the table and you go, what is this company's strategy? And they all, it's rumbling, and then somebody says something about this, and then somebody says something about that. And they kind of come together on this thing where everybody goes, that's not what I thought. And if you ask them separately, put them in different rooms, they'll have totally different answers, right? So if the alignment is poor there, how can that message be clearly understood all the way down to the organization, the folks who are going to execute? So that's part of the gap, because there are three legs to this triangle, right? And the leadership side of it is always so easy. It's easy to throw rocks at executives, right? They built a career on having rocks thrown at them. But the next question that I'd like to dig into is where it breaks down in practice at those lower levels between operations and IT. Let's say that the strategic vision is clear, right? We know what we're doing here. We are going to utilize technology to maximize our operational efficiencies based on these three very specific KPIs. So we got something clean and clear. Where do you see that breakdown from a perspective of the distance between operations and IT now that we've drawn the executive side of it close to each?
Right. So, almost always IT are putting in technology solutions that span the organization or the business unit, the P&L, depending on just how the organization is structured. They have to think about the end-to-end technology that runs across the space. And there's multifacets to that technology that interface with operations. Some of it doesn't, some of it's general communication, some of it's security. They have multiple facets that span across, but all of those facets integrate together in a technology platform.
Yeah.
Including data. And data is the output of process. So if you jump over to the operations, typically you have multiple departments within an operational chain, and the leaders of those departments are primarily interested in their department. The technology runs across those different departments. So right there, there's an immediate mismatch where you have a technology group thinking about how something streams across departments, while frequently operational leaders are focused on a piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a potential mismatch right out of the gate. The other piece where I see a lot of challenge is just the language that gets used in thinking about the intersection between technology and operations.
Mm-hmm.
Again, a lot of the people in operations have come up through the business. They understand the business, the core of the business extremely well. They've evolved with it. The technology people have lived in the technology space where they have had incremental steps in learning the technology that's present that the operations people have not. And the technology people have not grown up in the core of the business either. So you have a mismatch of language in terms of core competence, in terms of what you understand about those functions. You get those people together to talk about how they come together, it mismatches.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would say that's most important in that space is the operators are busy. Rarely do you walk into any type of business where the core operations people have free time. That would be a great scenario. You know, you read the book The Goal, they say you should go to a factory where people have free time. That tells you things are running great. You know, just you don't see that very often. So they want somebody to solve the technology for them. Just make this work.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have the time to understand the technology. So there's this language mismatch that occurs between the two. And as you're trying to match business process with the technology, frequently there's frustration that happens in that space. The frustration grows, and you really see the triangle, the angles of that triangle move further apart. So one, you've got a scope that could be different in terms of what they're responsible for. And then their historical perspectives lead to languages that really don't match very well against the value drivers that they share.
I think you make three great points in that, and I'm going to try to remember them all together as I kind of summarize what you said there. Because the first, I think, is a fantastic observation where IT kind of has this space where I have my technology, I have my ecosystem to operate in, and I got one thing to worry about that spans all of these operational centers, right? So we got sales, finance, production, manufacturing, procurement, purchasing, whatever you want to call them, supply chain, warehousing. IT kind of has this overarching view. From an operational perspective, people in the operations space have their siloed views. Like, I know warehousing, that's what I know. I know production and manufacturing, that's what I know. I really don't care what's happening over in procurement. As long as I get my raw materials for production, I'm good to go. I don't need to know their process. That's their problem, not mine. So those silos, that's an interesting dichotomy in that the business is siloed and fractured, but IT has this responsibility for understanding the whole of it. And there's a breadth versus depth issue in that you're kind of pulling at the strings on that. That's an interesting thought process. The second that I think is important is this language conversation, right? Competencies in space. At the end of the day, operations are an operational component of the business, right? They are the function of the business, whereas IT is an accelerator, right? It's an enabler. Can the business run without IT? Yeah, for the most part, most businesses can run without IT. I hate to say this because we're in a technical space, but for the most part, business can run without IT. Business can run without technology. People have been running businesses for thousands of years without IT, right? This is the IT department is, I'd say less than 40 years old as a standard in our small lifetime of doing business as a civilization. So that's possible. That doesn't mean that today they don't need to coexist, because if you're running a business without IT today, you are at a significant disadvantage and will find yourselves swallowed up by the industry. So I'm not at all trying to diminish the value there, but there's the engine and there's an enabler, right? And then if you think of the executive team as the driver on the whole, so there's a conduit within that. So those two difference in perspectives is another reason why this grows. The other thing that I think that you pointed out, the third thing that I think is a fantastic observation, is that now that we have different ways of looking at things and different layered perspectives from a breadth versus depth perspective, a frustration arises when there is a gap in that leg of the triangle. Yeah. And so as that frustration arises from that gap, that's a moment where you got to lean into it and close that gap, or the frustration will expand it, because now we start having a different problem, which is more a people problem. Like those people in IT, they don't understand the business. They're never going to. They don't run the business. Never worked a day in their life in the business. And IT says, all I'm trying to do is help here. And the business says they need this new CRM or whatever, and they don't. They got this. The tool they're asking for right here. I'm trying to show them, but they don't understand. And now we have this frustration that continues to grow. I think there's a perspective of this also where Gregory H. has pointed out from a learning curve perspective, that's different, right? He says the learning curve with AI is a thing that we have to go through, but it's not just AI in that space. It's a learning curve with technology that the business needs to go through, and a learning curve with the business that IT needs to go to help close this gap. Because at the end of the day, one of the questions that we get often is like, okay, so you got this great analogy, this devil's triangle. Well, cool. That's got a great name and everything. So what? How do we solve that problem? Or is it just a problem that's going to exist and we just got to accept it? We can solve this problem. And I'm curious, in your perspective, Dan, what the first steps are to breaking down this devil's triangle and shrinking the gaps between those corners.
So, if you think about there is a never-ending pile of literature out there about creating alignment in organizations. I mean, there's book after book, thousands of books you can read. And so frequently, it's about creating strategic alignment and alignment around outcomes. And that's absolutely necessary. I would never disagree with that. But I would say one of the things that I think gets underreported, and it has been studied, is the importance of tactical alignment when you deal with complexity. And I would make the argument, and there's research that backs this, that a lack of technical alignment or tactical alignment in a group of people who are actually aligned around the outcomes creates more dysfunction than the other way around. You could have tactical alignment with a messy outcome, and people actually get along better. Now, I would imagine anybody who's watching this, you, Adam, who's seen this play out dozens and dozens of times, how often have you actually seen tactical alignment at a granular level between the IT team and the operations team, to where they understand the interdependencies of those two teams on the outcome? You rarely see it. The cleanest example that I can think of in that space, and I've spent time in this space and I do not enjoy it, is cleaning up your data platform. Why is it that we have three answers for how much we've produced last week?
Yeah.
Why do we have three examples? Well, it's not that you have an incompetent IT group. You have disparities in process between the operations, data, and how you stand it up. It's not an IT problem. It's not just an operations problem. It's a problem of interdependencies between those groups. I have seen examples of where the level of planning goes down to tactical alignment, to where both the IT and operational people can see exactly where the data is produced, where the disparities are, and then you can figure out what actually has to happen to clean that up. And most of the time, it's a royal pain in the butt to clean it up. There's a level of detail that nobody wants to deal with because there's bigger fish to fry until you need that data. So I actually think there is, a lack of sophistication in the planning processes that pull operations and IT together to where they can actually see the interdependencies between the two. Most of the time when people see those interdependencies, they go, oh, I had no idea you needed to do that. I didn't recognize that needed to happen. That makes really good sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
The planning process you go to that visualizes this, that gets down to the level of granularity for people to actually see how the pieces and parts fit together to make the sausage, I think is missing in many organizations.
Well, yeah, and I love that scenario. I was like, I didn't realize that. One of my favorite aha moments in process workshops is when you got this is part of why when you're doing major technology transformation, having the teams that are interdependent together doesn't matter if you're talking about one department's requirements. Having them all in the room while you're talking about just the one department is important because what happens? Let me walk you through how this goes. If you separate them out, you have finance says I need this, supply chain says I do this, and production says I do that, and then you get this extraordinary level of detail on all these workarounds that are built for finance to respond to what they're getting from procurement, production to respond to what they're getting from procurement, and you have these things that are reactions to somebody's process in procurement. Now, just using this as an example, and then you put them in a room, and then somebody in procurement says, "This is the way that we do this because finance wants it that way," and finance goes, "What?" Or like, "What do you wanted? That's why for years." Like, well, that was how so and so wanted it. Now what I do is I take that garbage that you send me and I deconstruct it and I create this nice little neat thing. And they say, well, that's what I start with. And I spent 4 hours building you that thing. And then they're like, well, I spent 8 hours deconstructing it and trying to figure out all of it when we can just skip that 12 hours of work and I can send you the thing.
Right, right.
And that only happens when they see each other and they have that aha moment where it's like, you do this because of me? I do that because of you. And do we need to do this? And all of a sudden, literally the next day, they break that apart, they pull it apart, and then they just started saving 12 hours just by the sheer fact that you ran a workshop with them both in the room, right? Now, you can silo this out. That doesn't mean that it's unnecessary, that if you have busy teams, and it is what it is, but there's such a great moment in that when people realize how they're interconnected and what the consequences of that are. So that's one piece of it. But I think is also important about using data in this scenario is data is like the one thing that connects all layers of the hierarchy. And the way that I like to think about it is you have a leadership team, whether it's management, senior management, executive management, who's using a series of KPIs to understand the health of the business. Those KPIs are being generated through data, and then IT is helping through the process evaluation, the facilitation process and technology that collects the data, and then generating the reports for this management. Those data layers go all the way down to the nittiest grittiest piece of detail. And if one of them is misconstrued, the KPI the management is looking at is misconstrued. But what's important about this is now those KPIs are dials that management is using to understand the health of the business and then reacts to it. So they're going to turn those dials. And then what happens to that data is they twist that dial. All of the strings that are connected to it, all those layers of data, they pull, right? And this is a visual analogy of it. There's no actual pulling, but it does impact those inputs and outputs now that change that. And if that data isn't consistently defined, that ripples all the way through the organization because now we're stomping on one pedal and we're not realizing, and we're trying to figure out why we're slowing down instead of going faster, right? And there's all of these things that come together. And I think that in this, we have kind of a concept that's worth thinking about, which is how can technology make this problem worse? We've got the question of AI in here. We've got the thoughts on how IT operations fits into the conversation. But how can technology, in your opinion, make this space within the Devil's Triangle greater?
Make it better. Or
no, the space bigger, as in create a bigger problem.
Okay. Well, yeah. So and before I answer that, I have to jump onto one of the things as you were going down this path. If you think about the triangle and the different pieces of it, you think about how most organizations tackle the triangle, even if they don't call it that. As you're standing up an ERP or integrating AI workflows, you have a project management group, and then you almost always have a separate change management group.
Mm-hmm.
Two are rarely integrated together. So you have these, this one group that is tactically running the project, the other that is working on alignment of outcomes and training and communication. They're not aligned. And frequently, the project management group is working in a hub and spoke environment that doesn't pull the tactics together. And then you have this group that's accelerating communications, and oftentimes actually makes it worse. And you're undoing all of the communication that's happening, because that's their job, is we have to communicate. If the interdependencies shift and that's not being accounted for with a collective brain and a visual, the change management can actually make it worse.
Yeah.
So let's take that to the question you just asked. Let's say we're integrating new technologies into businesses, and I think AI is a good example. I've run into so many business leaders where I've asked, do you have an AI strategy in your business? Yes. What is it? Well, integrate AI in X space, this space. What does that really mean? Help me understand what that really means. They don't know. They don't know. Now, if you ask them, because it's been around for a while, what does it mean to put in an ERP? They can tell you in greater detail. They wouldn't be able to lead the project, but they can tell you in greater detail. So we're entering into a space where there's new technologies coming in that have the potential of creating efficiencies and value. People know they should be doing them, but they know less about it than the traditional technologies they've been dealing with. It creates a bigger gap in terms of the language that people are using. You and I have seen this in engagement with clients where the language is far off between IT and operations, far off. It's possible the IT group is actually executing agents in a business and the operators aren't even aware of it.
We saw that recently. It's like where literally the business owner was all like, we're in the middle of this conversation. We're talking about how this happens. And literally somebody from IT goes, we're doing that for you. And he goes, what? Had no idea. So in that space then, which is kind of right where we're kind of tinkering on the edge of, so I'm going to push it over the edge. Where does technology make this worse? When the left hand isn't speaking to the right, like we're doing that. You're doing what? Because I'm over here trying to define what AI means for me, and you're over here saying that you're already doing it. How could you possibly be doing that for me without telling me or asking me what I need to do? Right? And that's such a common issue between IT and operations, where I'm working on this with a separate client and rebuilding these communications and this trust, because IT has for so long just said we are supplying things to the business and they are outputting things and they're outputting things, and the business is like, what is this? And I said, well, that's how the system works now. Since when and why? It's fine like it is. And I said, well, we got you this new thing. Right. And the business is over here saying, well, I need these things. And IT says, well, we're busy. We can't give you those things because we're over here adding value for you, building these things that you don't know exist yet, but they're coming, I promise. And so you have this conversation where the business is saying, I need this, and IT is saying, I have this, and they're not the same thing. And now I get a lot of folks that know, well, you're just gonna, you give IT a hard time. You never give them credit for what they do. I'm not at all trying to misconstrue that. This is not a problem. This is an IT's problem. This isn't the business's problem. This is both of their problems. And this conversation needs to be reconstructed both ways, right? Because the business needs to stop buying their own technology and not telling IT. That happens too. And then a business says, well, I need this from this system. And they're like, since when do we have that system? like, oh, I bought that like 6 months ago. We just went live, and we have all of these problems, and it's like, I got broke stuff over here that I'm working on, and you're telling me now I got to fix that too. I didn't even know we had that system.
Right.
And so this isn't something that's IT's wrong and the business is right. The business is wrong and IT's right. Both, there's always enough blame to go around in this discussion. So I think that there's so many areas where that conversation doesn't come together. I think part of it is this thought process. Again, it comes back to the leadership side of it. Is leadership says, you ask them, what's your AI strategy? And they say, well, we're going to use it. And so tell the organization, go use AI. And IT says, cool, I'm going to go use AI. This is going to be awesome. And they start building things for the business. And the business says, cool, I'm going to start using AI. And they go do these other things. And then they come and talk to each other and like, well, we can't do that because we're doing this. And you can't do that because they're doing this. And now we have a mess that's created from a poorly articulated strategy. So lots of case studies on that thread for sure.
Well, it's I can say there's no malintent here. I remember as an operator and a user of technology, I would get frustrated with the IT group. Why can't we fix this? Why can't we do that? Well, then I got pulled into IT and began leading it, and I began to learn why. And I was like, oh, that's very helpful to understand. That's a legitimate reason people aren't connected on it. The other thing I think in this space, where the technology can make it worse. This idea of whether it's consultants or IT groups saying we're creating end-to-end solutions. Okay, there may be value in end-to-end solutions, and most businesses do require an ERP. When you're doing the end-to-end solutions, again, you're getting a technology solution that spans the business when people are oftentimes focused on their own. There are frequently opportunities to integrate technology that is not end-to-end, that significantly improves components of the operations that can be streamed together in a simpler way. But of course, there are people who would like to sell you end-to-end. You and I are both very aware of a situation where somebody is telling a client, we can handle this for you end-to-end. We can be domain experts for you in this space end-to-end. And
don't worry about it. We got this.
It sounds easy. It's one throat to choke. Well, it's not, unless you want to give ownership to a consultant or to somebody who doesn't own the process. They don't own the process. So the people who own the process, whether it's their department or the whole chain of it, have to be the people that pull the technology in and understand the implications.
Yes.
And we've seen plenty of examples. People run a workshop. We see what the end state should be. We got the future state. And then what happens? You give the future state to the technologists. They go off to Santa's workshop and do all of their work. And it comes back and people say, what is this? What is this? And there was no outcome adapted execution in the process to think through all of the shifts and changes that happen because the technology never perfectly matches the issues in the process. Never does.
And I want to blow that analogy wide open here by applying it to some of the spaces that we see it, right? I think we lost our counterpart here for a moment, so we'll see if we can get him back in, unless I'm the one that's lost. Hopefully not. But at the end of the day, one of the things that I think is important in this to think through is that one second, is this doesn't apply to just your internal team. This applies to what I like to refer to your whole implementation network, right? So when we talk about vendors in this conversation, we talk about IT, we talk about operations, we talk about leadership. Vendors are involved in that too. Third-party partners are involved in that. Your customers can be involved in that devil's triangle of misalignment. And when you have a vendor who says, we're going to handle this, what you've done is you've outsourced the execution and the IT side of the conversation to a group whose executive leadership now you're dependent on for creating that cohesive model. And when we think about it that way, that cohesive model creates issues where their leadership has different goals because they're a different organization. They are looking to extract revenue from your organization, which is normal. Um, that's not to say that there are issues with execution in the space of hiring vendors. But what it is to say is that when we have other folks that we bring into this conversation, you have a problem where their leadership has different goals than your leadership. And now when they have an IT and operations gap, it's obscured from your vision. And so I'm glad to get you back here, Dan, because I'm about to ask a good question of you, which is in the space of, we talk a lot about heavy industry, and that's what the Confluential specializes in, particularly with metals and resources and the like. These are industries that we have found are different, right? Most businesses say we're different because we have these requirements, and you kind of diagnose it like, actually, you're just like everybody else. Metals, manufacturing, mining, resource oriented industries, especially that are heavy asset oriented, they actually are different. And you need to understand both operations and IT in one common language, because if you don't, you have to find a way of translating, and that things get lost in translation. So I'm curious, in your experience, what you've seen be effective ways of that translation happening between operations in the business when there are those complexities that are unique to things like metals, and what happens when you bring in a vendor who either reinforces those complexities or simplifies them, and what success looks like in integrating that conversation into the devil's triangle.
Yeah. And I've seen it go both ways with folks that you bring in, folks who say they can simplify and don't, and actually create complexity, and those who actually can break down tremendous amounts of complexity. The biggest differentiator, I would say, when you think about sizing up somebody who can come in and help your business, is can they demonstrate some level of domain expertise or the capacity to consume the domain expertise in your business? Even if they haven't worked in your core business, can they demonstrate the capacity to understand your business processes at a level that facilitates a fit gap of technology that will actually work for you? We've never worked in this business, but we've worked in businesses similar to it. Well, help us understand what you saw in those businesses that would be similar to ours. Oh yeah, they're similar. Well, they struggle. And we know they're going to send in a team of junior people who have never seen any of those pieces, and they're going to turn a crank on their consulting processes that really don't build a landscape where you can fit gap technology against the solutions that you need. Pulling in people that actually have worked in the business, that understand the domain, have the capacity to understand the domain, can understand all of those pieces of the value chain that you mentioned, Adam, from order management, procurement, through the operations, the shop floor management, the maintenance systems, the asset management, so that you can actually fit technology to the gaps of value that you have in your business. I don't think organizations know how to do that very well, to size up and do that very well. When you begin to expose the cracks of a consulting firm against that potential to do a legitimate fit gap, it becomes really easy to make a decision of who can actually help you achieve value.
Yeah. But I think there's a lot of that's really important to think about too. One of the things that I think is interesting in this space is that whether we're talking about it from a client perspective or even professional development perspectives, there are just certain things that sometimes are natural to you. You've been doing them so long that you don't realize that they're hard, right? With this challenge, I think is overemphasized and understated in industries like resourcing and metals, because these are folks who have been doing those things their whole careers. And these, all of the things that are unique, that literally are unique to this space, are normal to them. Well, why wouldn't you have mass balancing? And you ask anybody outside the industry what mass balancing is, and they're like, huh? What is that? And then you start talking to vendors, and they're like, oh, yeah, we can do that. And it's like, okay, so let's break this down on what we actually mean by mass balancing. And then all of a sudden people go, oh, oh no, we can't do that. Now that I connected. But the problem here is that most of the time you don't have somebody who can articulate why that's different. Identify what is different by having seen it from outside industries and saying, this is, you do this different. You don't think so because it's normal to you, but this is different. And we need to make sure that we can cover that, because we don't need you to find out how different that is when you're 6 months into a multi-million-dollar implementation and be like, well, now what do we do? Will we start over? No, because we're 6 months in. Like, hey, we can't do that. Now we're screwed, right? So in that space, there's a lot of that. And I think that this kind of speaks to Mick's question on how do you translate business requirements into technical requirements. And this is one of those operations to technology translations that is almost like if you throw in the concept of an industry that does have natural complexities to it, be mining, metals, resourcing, and the like, you have a dialect issue now. This is like trying to take somebody from Boston and have somebody who understands English as a second language from like China and say, now tell me what that person just said. And they're like, huh? I don't know. They're not speaking English. I don't know that language. And they're like, actually, it is English. You just don't know it because it's a dialect, right? And I'm not picking on Boston or anything like that. I don't know why they came to mind at the moment. But the thought process really truly is a translation, and having somebody who can do that is so important, especially when in an industry like heavy, in industries like heavy manufacturing, that those are particular, and knowing where and why, because that's where technology operation gaps can become challenging internally. And then when you pull in external vendors, you start to push them apart, and that frustration grows and it pushes them apart even further. And it doesn't, just by sheer pushing those apart, they start to diverge from the strategic alignment that you created to start with, because now we're frustrated. Now we have miscommunication, mistranslations. And I don't even know if what I think I know about that strategy applies, because I'm learning so much about what language I don't know. How do I know that it's aligned with that? So there's a good bit of that in my mind is a part of the challenge. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that that little monologue.
Well, I think, when you're pulling a team of people together to lead a technology initiative, I think one of the primary criteria is their ability to connect on a common language that drives value in the business. And you're never going to have within the devil's triangle or the resources that are working in it people who speak the exact same language. But you can construct that in a way that gives them the best opportunity to do so, learn from each other, and tighten that triangle. The idea of, are we setting up our teams to where we can achieve tactical alignment faster? I'm rarely part of selection processes or integration plans or setting up the project where people are talking about that as a criteria. Or even within an organization, when you talk about the devil's triangle, are we setting up our teams in a way that allow for tactical alignment between these different groups? It should be a driving criteria, and it's a space that we operate in to help people make those choices, to improve the chances that those conversations do align, that the language is connected. And I'll give a couple examples, from my experience in the metal space. Costing products in the metal space is different than in very discrete manufacturing, where you're making shoes or something like that. product tracking and visibility so that you can stand up the visibility of a product to a customer. Very, very different than if you're manufacturing a car. If you go order a car, they can show you where you are in process. If you order, you go configure your car, you can see where it is. That's much harder to do in the metal space when you have 250,000 tons of liquid steel that are going into a whole bunch of different products. It's hard to track 1 ton of that steel while it's liquid. It's all mixed together with the rest of it. If you have no context of that language or the methodology of how you break that down into systems or processes that technology attaches to, the learning curve is very, very steep. So to me, if you're empowered to lead a technology integration, the most important thing you can do, 2 of them, is 1, get clear on outcomes, but then focus heavily on constructing a team of people that have the best opportunity to share language to achieve tactical alignment. And of course, there are ways that you set up your project management, your change management, which we call change intelligence, to facilitate that so that you can get there quicker.
Yeah, when as you mentioned change intelligence, and I'm going to bite hard on that, and I want you to define the difference between change management and change intelligence for the audience.
So, I've never seen a change management model that addresses tactical alignment. I've not seen that. I see a compelling vision. I see outcome alignment. I see celebrating wins. I see training. I see communications. I see all of these things. I see, cross-functional steering committees. But what that tells me is that the people who are engaged in the change are not deeply integrated into the actual mechanics of the work that has to happen. And it's within the actual work, the tasks, the durations, and the interdependencies of those tasks across those operating functions through the technology stream where the change intelligence magic happens. And we like to call it outcome adapted execution. First of all, the way we build the plan is different. It's visual, and everybody can see how their piece connects to the other. So you get the conversation, well, I didn't know that had, now I see why you do that. I didn't realize that connected. And then when you begin to execute the plan, the chances of it going 100% according to plan is 0%. That never happens. So how do you bring that group together to evaluate the changing dynamics and what that does to the interdependencies within that plan? If you are not constantly addressing those interdependencies at the tactical level, you will get cracks. Those cracks will grow the longer they don't get addressed. I've never seen change management address those cracks. Never. Change intelligence lives in addressing those cracks as they emerge. That's the difference.
Well, I think that there are a couple of pieces of this that are interesting to me, right? There's at the end of the day, a lot of change management, program management, strategic management, all this stuff. And this is a fault in the devil's triangle that creates issues too, is because I said something is going to happen, somebody will take care of it. There's kind of like that tragedy of the commons where it's kind of, if everybody owns it, nobody owns it. But you're saying that somebody is going to do it. And therefore, because as a leader in this organization, I said somebody will do it, then somebody will do it. And that very rarely happens that way unless somebody takes ownership of it. Then that's the only way that the execution happens. So from a change intelligence perspective, having that ownership of the actual execution and the outcome of that execution is such a critical component in what we apply in our programs. The other thing about it that's kind of ringing in my head, and I've been hearing this on a lot of the things that I listened to recently, is this thought process of thinking about the thing is not doing the thing. Planning to do the thing is not doing the thing. Reading about people who did the thing isn't doing the thing. Talking to people about how you're going to do the thing isn't doing the thing. Posting about it on the internet about what you're going to do when you do the thing isn't doing the thing. Planning on what happens after the thing isn't doing the thing. Only doing the thing is doing the thing, right? Only facilitating the actual change with your hands on it is facilitating change. All this other change management, hoopla, garbage, whatever you want to call it, is all talking about doing the thing, reading about, planning to do the thing, all that, assuming that the thing is just going to happen. Somebody has to, at the end of the day, do the thing. And if your thought process is because I said it's going to happen, somebody will do it, then you are inviting the devil's triangle to just expand unchecked. And then you'll find out how big it is when the thing doesn't happen and you thought it did 6 months ago. And you realize that your technology deployment is now millions of dollars over budget because you didn't actually do the thing. So that's there's a lot in that change intelligence I think is different from change management because it is how do we execute the thing and focus on the outcome of it so that when we do it, we know what happened and then we can, and this is for me the intelligence piece of it because there's an adaptability to it. When you actually facilitate and execute the change, something is going to change, right? That's the whole goal. So an outcome is going to change. Now I'm going to check that outcome and say, did that outcome go the direction that I thought? And this is a couple of steps after where change management is left off. That is the whole value of the conversation. Change management leaves off from did the change actually happen? Was it actually executed? Yes or no? And then what happened? What was the outcome change? And then, was that a good thing or a bad thing? Does it change where we wanted it to and how much we wanted it to? And the intelligence part comes from the muscle memory learning, which is now how do we make that change better? If it got to where we wanted it to, now how do we pour it on and really expand that advantage? Or it didn't get to where we wanted to. Why? And that's the other piece of the puzzle that I think that needs to come together in the conversation. So
a key word in that is we.
Yes, that's a
the last thing I'll pile on there. Just very simply, if you look at a technology integration, and you have a project management office and a change management group, and it's not the same group, I would say that's a warning sign. That is a warning sign. And if you're evaluating change management providers, I'd just like to find a change practitioner out there that's worked in the same job for more than 2 years. It's hard to find them.
Well, they're very good at changing jobs.
That's what they're good at. That's
why they're change practitioners.
Or if they actually ever led one, you can't find them.
So there's a lot in that, and as we look at this, I want to get your thoughts on one last topic, because we talk about the devil's triangle, we talk about change intelligence, we talk about heavy industry and metals and resourcing and all of that jazz. I'd like you to just share your opinion on what are the advantages that those types of traditional heavy industries have in managing the devil's triangle, and what are the disadvantages from a metals, mining, resourcing perspective that you've seen that we can have people watch out for?
Yeah. So I think, one of the disadvantages is that if you bring technology people in from other industries, the business processes are so different than other industries. Out of the gate, the potential for a technologist coming into the metal space, some of those things I mentioned earlier in terms of the real value drivers and the complexity of the business processes are hard to plug into.
Yeah,
right? There's a significant learning curve because there's some real complexity in those processes. I do think because they are asset intensive businesses, the potential of the operators who understand those businesses so well, actually migrating into kind of the OT space that can partner with IT when you get that nice partnership of IT, OT, which I see happening a lot, can really create a lot of synergy. And I think that's a real opportunity in the metal space, but that adds another element to the triangle that you got to manage.
I think that's a fantastic scenario, and one of the examples that we even saw recently. I was on a phone call with a vendor talking about software selection. This is for a recent mining client of mine that we're talking about, and somebody goes, "Well, we've got to scope out your project. We got to talk about the production workbench and the shop floor and this, that, and the other." And somebody who actually has experience with this comes from the back of the room and goes, "They don't need any of that. They're a mining organization. There's no production floor. There is no series of work orders. This is that they are going to mine and they are going to turn the mine on. It's either going to be on or it's going to be off." So this whole concept of bombs, routings, recipes, whatever doesn't exist in this space, so we don't need to scope that in. And the guy that was kind of gearing up to show his level of experience and how much manufacturing they could offer was just absolutely dumbfounded with this thought process. Like, you don't need the shop floor work bench. Everybody needs that, right? But this is different. This is why we think that we're not that different, because it's always been this way. And then you talk to somebody who does it the way that everybody else does, and you notice that difference. So, want to wrap up here as we close out on that particular thought, because I think it's important to understand what industries are different and why it is the confluential focus is in heavy industries, metals, resourcing, and thank you for your time today as well. For those of you who listened in, thank you for your time listening today. Hope you have a wonderful weekend. If you have additional questions or challenges in the space, want to talk a little bit more, please feel free to reach out and DM us on LinkedIn or wherever you find us. Comment on here. Kyler always goes through and sorts through all the comments, whether or not they happen live or afterwards, to make sure that we are addressing everybody's thoughts and needs. So we'd love to continue to hear from you. So thanks for joining us, and have a weekend.